He'd walk away from a $3.6 million NFL contract to fight in a war. But the truth about his death would shake America to its core. Pat Daniel Tillman Jr. was born on November 6, 1976, in Fremont, California. From the very beginning, he stood out, not because he was the biggest or the strongest kid, but because he had an unshakable will. His childhood was filled with energy, competition, and a fierce sense of loyalty to the people he cared about. Growing up in a middle-class family, Pat was the eldest of three brothers. His parents, Patrick and Mary Tillman, encouraged independence and resilience. Pat took that to heart. He was adventurous, fearless, and sometimes stubborn to a fault. If someone told him something couldn't be done, it was almost guaranteed he'd try to prove them wrong. At Bret Harte Middle School, Pat wasn't just an average student. He was already showing leadership qualities. Friends remember him as fiercely protective, the kind of kid who would stand up for anyone being bullied, no matter the cost. But his real passion began to shine on the football field. When he entered Leland High School in San Jose, Pat was far from an intimidating figure for football. He was small compared to other players, standing just 5 feet 11 inches and weighing under 200 pounds. Coaches and opponents underestimated him. That was a mistake. Pat had something that couldn't be measured on a scale: relentless determination. During his junior year, tragedy struck. A fight broke out near a local swimming pool, and Pat jumped in to protect a friend. In the chaos, he struck another teenager and faced serious legal trouble. He could have been expelled or worse. But instead of letting this incident define him, Pat used it as a wake-up call. He poured every ounce of his energy into football, academics, and self-discipline. By his senior year, Pat had transformed himself into the heart and soul of the Leland High School Chargers. He played linebacker with a ferocity that belied his size. In 1993, he led the team to a Central Coast Section Division I football championship. His performance on the field earned him a scholarship to Arizona State University, a dream opportunity for someone who'd been told his whole life he wasn't big enough to play at the next level. But Pat's high school years weren't just about football. He was a top student, often staying up late to finish assignments after grueling practices. He valued loyalty over popularity, keeping a close circle of lifelong friends. He was deeply committed to his girlfriend, Marie, who would later become his wife. Even then, people noticed something different about him. He wasn't chasing fame or money. He was chasing excellence. Looking back, those who knew Pat during this time agree. His competitive fire was unmatched. Whether it was on the football field, in the classroom, or even in a casual game of backyard basketball, Pat played to win. But more importantly, he played with heart. This foundation, his resilience, loyalty, and refusal to quit, would shape every decision he made in the years to come. And eventually, it would lead him down a path few could have imagined. When Pat Tillman arrived at Arizona State University in 1994, he was still considered undersized for big-time college football. At just 5 feet 11 inches and barely 200 pounds, most recruiters had overlooked him. But ASU's coaches saw something others didn't: his relentless drive, unmatched work ethic, and leadership. Pat quickly made his mark on the Sun Devils football team. Playing linebacker, he became known for his punishing tackles and fearless style. He wasn't the fastest player on the field, but he read plays like a chess master. Teammates recall how he studied opponents endlessly, sometimes spending more time in the film room than on the practice field. By his senior year, he had led the Sun Devils to the 1997 Rose Bowl and earned the Pac 10 Defensive Player of the Year award. Off the field, Pat was equally remarkable. He earned a degree in marketing in just 3.5 years, maintaining a GPA over 3.8. Professors remembered him as a student who always sat up front, asked challenging questions, and never missed class, even during football season. He was living proof that you could excel both as an athlete and as a scholar. In the 1998 NFL Draft, Pat was selected in the 7th round by the Arizona Cardinals, the 226th pick overall. For many players, being drafted so late meant their career might be short-lived. But Pat saw it as just another challenge. He would have to fight for his place in the league, and fight he did. From the moment he arrived at training camp, Pat's intensity was impossible to ignore. Coaches saw a rookie who outworked veterans, stayed long after practice to study plays, and refused to back down from anyone, no matter their size or status. Within weeks, he earned a starting position as safety, a position that required speed, intelligence, and courage. On the field, Pat Tillman was a blur of motion, diving into tackles, breaking up passes, and charging the plays that others might hesitate to engage. He set a franchise record for tackles in a single season and became one of the most respected defensive players in the league. Off the field, Pat lived differently from many of his NFL peers. He drove a used truck instead of a luxury car. He rode his bicycle practice. He even turned down a $9 million offer from the St. Louis Rams out of loyalty to the Cardinals, saying he owed the team that had believed in him. Despite his growing fame, Pat remained grounded. He spent his free time with his wife Marie, his brothers, and close friends. He avoided the spotlight, preferring to focus on what he saw as more important values: honor, commitment, and personal integrity. By 2001, Pat Tillman was at the peak of his NFL career. He had proven his critics wrong and built a reputation as one of the toughest, smartest, and most dedicated players in the game. But just when it seemed his future was secure, the world would change in a single day, and so would his path. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Pat Tillman was living the dream. He was 25 years old, in the prime of his NFL career, and preparing for another season with the Arizona Cardinals. That morning, like millions of Americans, he turned on the television and saw the world change. The Twin Towers were burning. Smoke billowed over New York City. People were jumping to escape the flames. Then the second plane hit. For most, it was a day of disbelief and horror. For Pat, it was something more, a call to action. In the days that followed, America was in shock. The NFL continued its season, but the atmosphere in stadiums was different. The cheers felt quieter. The air was heavier. Soldiers were deploying overseas, and the war on terror was beginning. Pat started thinking deeply about his life. Friends remember him saying that football was important, but it wasn't everything. He had always believed in service, in doing something greater than himself. Now, the idea was impossible to ignore. In the spring of 2002, Pat made a decision that would stun the sports world. He turned down a $3.6 million contract extension from the Arizona Cardinals. Instead, he and his younger brother, Kevin, a professional baseball player, enlisted in the U.S. Army. There was no press conference, no publicity stunt. Pat didn't want attention for his choice. In fact, he asked the team and the media to keep quiet. He believed serving his country was a personal duty, not a headline. When the news eventually broke, the reaction was explosive. Sports commentators called it unbelievable, inspirational, and the ultimate sacrifice. Fans wrote letters thanking him for his service. But Pat refused to see himself as a hero. He said in an interview months earlier, foreshadowing his decision, "Sports are important. They're part of our society, but they're not life or death. I've never been able to justify spending my entire life playing a game while others are dying for something they believe in." Pat and Kevin reported for basic training in May 2002. It was a radical change, from stadium lights and roaring crowds to barracks, early morning runs, and military discipline. They trained hard, pushing themselves to the limits. Pat, who had been a star on the football field, was now just another soldier. wearing the same uniform, eating the same rations, and sleeping in the same bunks. To Pat, that was exactly the point. By the end of the year, the Tillman brothers were members of the elite Army Rangers. Their first deployment would take them to Iraq in 2003 as the United States launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. The NFL, his fans, his former teammates watched from afar, proud, but also worried. Pat had left behind fame, money, and security for something he believed mattered more. He was no longer chasing victories on the scoreboard. He was chasing something far more elusive: honor. When Pat Tillman and his younger brother Kevin enlisted in the U.S. Army in May 2002, they entered a world completely different from professional sports. Gone were the stadium lights, the roar of the crowd, and the comfort of NFL facilities. In their place, early mornings before sunrise, grueling physical training, and the strict discipline of military life. Pat embraced it. From the very first day of basic training, he pushed himself to exceed every standard. He wasn't there to coast on his fame. In fact, most of the men training alongside him didn't even realize they were sharing a barracks with an NFL star. Pat never mentioned it. After completing basic training in airborne school, Pat and Kevin began the intense journey toward becoming U.S. Army Rangers, one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. Ranger school was relentless. Endless marches with heavy packs, sleep deprivation, and a constant test of mental endurance. The physical challenges were brutal. But for Pat, the mental side was just as important. He studied military tactics, memorized maps, and paid attention to every detail. His instructors noticed his leadership skills, his ability to stay calm under pressure, and his willingness to help others succeed. By late 2002, both brothers had earned their place in the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. It was a tight-knit unit where loyalty and trust meant survival. Pat fit right in. In March 2003, they deployed to Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. For the first time, Pat found himself in a war zone. Dust-filled air, scorching heat, and the constant awareness that danger could come from any direction. He participated in missions to clear buildings, secure roads, and provide support for larger operations. Even in a combat environment, Pat stayed true to his principles. He refused to be used for military publicity. The Army had suggested photographing him in uniform for recruitment purposes, but Pat declined. He wanted no special treatment, no spotlight, just to do his job. After their tour in Iraq, the Tillman brothers returned to the United States briefly, but there was no long rest ahead. In 2004, they received order for Afghanistan, a place where the war was fought not in open deserts but in rugged mountains and remote valleys. Pat knew Afghanistan would be different. The terrain was treacherous, the enemy elusive, and the missions unpredictable. Yet he welcomed the challenge. He trained harder than ever, running in full gear, practicing marksmanship, and studying maps of the region. In March 2004, Pat and Kevin deployed to eastern Afghanistan. Their unit was tasked with counterinsurgency missions, patrolling remote villages, disrupting enemy movements, and building trust with local communities. It was dangerous work, requiring not only physical toughness, but sharp instincts and constant vigilance. Pat thrived in this environment. He respected his fellow soldiers, cared deeply for their safety, and always volunteered for the hardest assignments. To him, the Ranger motto, "Rangers lead the way," wasn't just a slogan. It was how he lived. But within weeks, a mission would take Pat into the mountains of Khas province and change everything forever. April 22nd, 2004, eastern Afghanistan. Pat Tillman's platoon was moving through the rugged mountains of Khas province. The mission: support Afghan troops in clearing a remote village near the Pakistan border. The terrain was brutal: steep cliffs, narrow canyons, and dry riverbeds. Vehicles struggled to navigate the twisting paths. At one point, The convoy split into two groups to move faster. Pat was with the dismounted team, advancing on foot. Communication was poor. Static crackled over the radios, and orders were unclear. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Echoes bounced off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell where the shots were coming from. Pat and his team scrambled for cover. He called out positions, directing his men with calm, deliberate commands. To the others, it seemed like enemy forces were closing in, but in the confusion, tragedy struck. Another group of U.S. soldiers, believing they were firing on the enemy, unleashed a burst of rounds toward Pat's position. When the shooting stopped, Pat Tillman was down. The firefight ended, but the shock had just begun. In the chaos of battle, an American hero had been killed, not by the enemy, but by his own. In the hours after the firefight, the official word was clear. Pat Tillman had been killed by enemy gunfire while protecting his men. The story spread quickly. Newspapers called him a hero. Politicians praised his sacrifice. The Army held a memorial service honoring his bravery in combat. But behind the scenes, whispers began to circulate. Soldiers who had been there knew something was wrong. The wounds, the angles, they didn't match the official account. Quietly, commanders were informed Pat Tillman had died from friendly fire. For weeks, the truth was kept from the public and from Pat's own family. His mother, Mary, began asking questions. Why were details changing? Why did eyewitness accounts conflict? The answers were vague, evasive. Finally, 5 weeks after his death, the Army admitted the truth. Pat had been accidentally shot by members of his own unit. The revelation was devastating, not just because of mistake, but because of the cover-up. To his family, it felt like Pat's integrity had been betrayed. The hero's death that had inspired millions now carried a shadow. And the question remained, why had the truth been hidden for so long? Pat Tillman's story did not end in the mountains of Afghanistan. If anything, that's where his legend truly began. He is remembered not only for his skill on the football field or his service as an Army Ranger, but for the principles he lived by: loyalty, integrity, and selflessness. He believed in doing what was right, even when it meant walking away from fame, fortune, and comfort. In the years after his death, the Pat Tillman Foundation was created to honor his memory. It provides scholarships and leadership training to veterans, active service members, and their families, helping others continue the mission of service that Pat valued so deeply. His number 40 was retired by the Arizona Cardinals. Statues and memorials stand in his honor, but those who knew him say the real tribute is not in stone or ceremony. It's in living with the same courage and commitment he showed every day. Pat Tillman's life is a reminder that greatness is not measured by wealth or applause, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. And that's why, even today, Pat's spirit still leads the way.